Grace folded the crumpled note until the crease remembered her thumb. 10 minutes, it whispered, or a life would tilt. She stood in the airplane aisle and watched Rebecca smile, like sanctuary. Then a recorded voice played across the cabin, and the smile turned to glass. In 10 minutes, a mother could lose her name or discover who had written it. Some betrayals begin with kindness. Some end with an entire world awake. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if the story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. I remember the airport like a city of small betrayals. The way the coffee tasted thin and overworked, the fluorescent light that flattened faces into cautious maps, the perpetual hiss of announcements that broke a traveler's moment into pieces. I remember the letter in Grace's hand, a single sheet folded 3 times, edges soft from being opened and closed until the crease had the look of a promise and a dare. She kept it folded against her palm as if heat from her skin might make the ink rise and speak. Grace Thomas moved through the aisle with a careful grace that belied the storm under her ribs. She was not the kind of woman who loved attention. She had learned long ago to read rooms, their temperature, their soft rules, and then to fit herself inside them without making a sound. Today she wore a navy coat, a scarf wrapped once, and shoes that knew how to tread without complaint. Her hair was braided close to her head, neat and deliberate. Her passport photo stared up at her from the ticket folder like an accusation and a promise at once. On the tray before her, the folded letter stayed like a secret animal. It smelled faintly of lemon and the dust of hotel rooms. Someone had once cried on it, she thought, because the corner still held the memory of salt. The words on the first line were blunt and impossible to ignore. Keep your voice ready. 10 minutes. The rest of the page was less direct, scribbles, a name crossed out, a time that did not match the flight manifest. She had been given that paper in a parking garage under sodium light by a man with a habit of looking at his shoes. Grace had kept it because she believed in obligations that arrived wrapped in danger. She breathed, slow and deliberate, tasting recycled air and a faint tang of citrus cleaner. Around her, the plane hummed into life, small lights blinking like insects. Babies slept with mouths half open. A businessman scrolled through a tablet as if he could negotiate more hours out of the sky. A woman 3 rows up laughed at something on the screen, and the sound felt like a candle in a dark room. Grace's knuckles whitened just a little as she smoothed the paper and tucked it back into the inner pocket of her bag. She told herself the nervousness was for show, a story she was letting play on the surface while she steered deeper currents below. The observer sees the same things, but without the private pulse. Grace Thomas sat in seat 17C, window down, posture contained. She had the look of someone returning from a small war and trying to keep the truce. Others on the plane were nameless shapes moving through habits. She was a shape defined by angles and a folded note. She had the industry of a woman who could manage deadlines and children and witnesses, but the world around her did not know that. To them, she was simply the person beside the aisle, tethered to their own inward dramas. There was a photograph inside the folder, too, tucked under the letter, a small snapshot of a child with a cowlick laughing too wide for the frame. Daniel. She had whispered the name as if it were both confession and liturgy. He was 5 and stubborn and slept with 1 sock on. The idea of him waiting at the apartment, a stack of drawings on the table, a half-finished tooth in his mouth, it steadied something in her chest. Everything she did was for the span of his small days and the heavier future she could shape for him. She kept her phone in airplane mode and read the text messages that did not arrive. Hope is a practice, she thought. It requires repetition. Grace's hands trembled slightly when the seatbelt sign chimed off and someone in front of her stood and stretched. She clenched the paper until the seam of the fold left its mark. The letter's cryptic line, 10 minutes, had lodged inside her like a seed with its own purpose. It meant time measured, stakes drawn. She could not tell if the instruction was for her or for the person who had handed it to her, or if danger and hope had been accidentally stapled together. Around her, the cabin murmured. The flight attendants moved down the aisle like conductors in a small orchestra, smiling efficient smiles. One of them, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a name tag that read Jenna, passed by with a drink cart, her laugh clipped by habit. Grace watched Jenna's hands as if they might offer a map. People are marked by what they do with their hands, she thought. Some grip power, some offer it away. The plane was not kind to secrets. Recliners were narrow, privacy was a myth, and the world was too small for a woman to be alone with a paper that hummed like a live wire. Grace had almost learned to be invisible when the world required it. Invisibility was a skill sharpened by years of being overlooked and then having to make a loud entrance when the moment demanded. She was tired of invisible labor, the kind that built careers and households without any public ledger. She was tired of carrying weight and having others imagine it as an accessory. From outside, the story is almost cruelly simple. A woman in seat 17C, traveling alone, returning to a small apartment and a small son. She clutched a folded letter that meant something she could not yet say out loud. Staff performed their small duties, and the aircraft moved through sky that was both indifferent and full of rumor. But even in its plainness, there are edges. The way the air vents clicked, the soft clatter of overhead bins, the smell of someone's lunch daring to exist in a sealed space. It is in the edges that a storm begins. Grace rose from her seat because the human body keeps its own calendar, and because the letter had made the concept of 10 minutes into a drumbeat she could feel in the bones of her wrists. Her movements were purposeful. She threaded past a man with earbuds who blinked sleep away, past a woman applying lipstick as if she could redraw whole life with a few strokes. When she reached the front of the cabin, the door to the lavatory was closed and a soft light bled out from beneath. She put a hand to the door, feeling the temperature, and then she felt the door handle move from the other side, and then a voice, bright and clipped, said, "Occupied." There was nothing notable in that word until it became containment. Grace lingered, the letter warm and small in her jacket pocket. The cabin around her functioned like a city with rules. One of those rules was that you waited, but the paper had said 10 minutes, and Grace's life had lately been ruled by smaller, sharper numbers. She weighed the quiet of waiting against the way delay always seemed to grow teeth when she was nearest to them. The narrative knows what people seldom allow themselves to know, that ordinary moments accumulate into decisive ones. A plane's hum can become a drum of complaint. A closed door can become a barricade. Grace has walked into this ordinary storm because obligations have a way of stacking against you until they are nearly impossible to carry. She thought of Daniel, of the photograph in her folder, of the man in the garage who spoke as if the world might change on a single signal. She thought of how small decisions, taken in 10-minute parcels, could tilt someone's life. She folded her hands for a moment, the letter pressing into her palm, and breathed. The plane soared on, indifferent, and everything that could happen next waited just beyond the curve of the door. The plane had not yet found its rhythm when the small war inside Grace began again. Her throat tightened with a dull, familiar tug, the kind that starts in the stomach and blooms into a cold certainty behind the ribs. The letter in her pocket seemed to pulse with the same impatience she felt. 10 minutes, the words had been said. 10 minutes could mean a meeting that turned the corner of a life, a window that closed, a child left waiting. 10 minutes could also be the thin margin between being noticed and being erased. She rose because her body asked for it, because being cramped amplified the pressure behind her eyes, because the idea of holding everything inside suddenly felt impossible. The light from the overhead had made small halos around the metal fastenings. She moved as quietly as she could, but the plane was a tight theater where the smallest action drew focus. People turned, just a little, as if the air itself wanted to know what would happen next. The narrator watches and keeps distance. Seat 17C is now an actor moving toward an ordinary door. The lavatory is a threshold, The airplane is a narrow world where the most private things are also public. Grace's steps are sure, but her hands betray her. She touches the door, finds it warm, and again hears that bright, clipped voice from behind the curtain. Occupied. The word lands with the authority of ritual in the confined geometry of the cabin. Though the ritual can be weaponized, Grace waited. She counted the breaths like a child learning to pray. 1, 2, 3. Her pulse was a small drum. The letter in her pocket was like a second heartbeat. She imagined Daniel at home, possibly coloring, maybe pressing a sticker into the wrong place and laughing at his own mistake. It steadied her. It also made the 10 minutes into something that mattered not just to her body, but to a future she had been crafting in small, stubborn acts. The observer notes patterns. When people in power see discomfort, they often recode it. A passenger asks to use the lavatory. The attendant says occupied. A pause becomes a denial. A polite refusal can harden. Grace felt the air change. The woman in the row across from her, pale, with a necklace that glittered like a small altar, watched Grace with the kind of attention that catalogs. Her lips were flat, as if she had swallowed a secret and decided to hold it. The man beside her, broad-shouldered, kept his gaze downward. Neither volunteered to help. The cabin is filled with small decisions and the silence of people who choose not to notice. Grace knocked softly, the sound swallowed by carpet and aluminum. "Excuse me," she said, in a voice that tried to be small. The word excuse lay on her tongue awkwardly. It was both plea and protocol. The handle moved. For a second, there was the hope of relief, but then the door opened a fraction, and a woman emerged like a tide pulling back. Her eyes slid over Grace and rested, too long, on the letters outlined visible at the edge of Grace's jacket. She said nothing. She walked past with a practiced indifference, her face arranged like a scene in a play. Jenna reached the spot then, appearing as if from an adjoining scene, her smile tight, a name tag that shone with polished rules. "Ma'am, we need to keep the aisles clear," she said, voice even as if air could be smoothed by tone. She gestured toward the seat. Her hand was a map of professionalism. To an impartial watcher, it was an ordinary instruction, part of the choreography of flight. To Grace, it felt like a wall. She tried to explain the urgency without the story spilling open. "I'm okay," she began. The narrator leans close now, the voice soft and knowing. There are histories folded into simple refusals. There is a history in the way certain bodies are measured against the public good and found, without comment, irregular. Grace felt the shape of it, the way the attendant's eyes moved with an economy that learned long ago to read which requests mattered. A ship of small decisions kept course because of habit and fear. The refusal settled like dust, thin but slowing. A sound cut across the plane then, sudden and mechanical, the chime of a call button in the row behind her. Heads turned again. The broad-shouldered man across the aisle, who had been looking down, now lifted his chin. Something about the movement made Grace uneasy. He was the kind of person whose silence had a weight. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering in a way that made the movement intimate and purposeful. The woman with the necklace shifted, and the click of her tongue was audible. Moments stacked like cards. Grace tried one more time, and in her voice there was a tremor that now showed instead of hiding. "Please," she said. She did not finish. Saying names out loud sometimes broke the spell. The attendant's jaw tightened, practiced politeness punctured by a micro-expression, a flash. "Ma'am, you can wait," Jenna said. "We'll let you know." 10 minutes, the letter had said, but the time on the plane stretched and thinned like a rubber band. The observer takes note of simple facts. The flight was not full. There was no turbulence that demanded everyone be seated. The lavatory had been used a moment ago. There was no logistical reason for the delay. Yet rules are often flexible in the direction of those above. Grace felt each second like a small betrayal. It was not yet a scandal. It was a series of everyday refusals that, together, formed an iron hinge. She watched the man across from her, call him Aaron, if names will help, because he seemed to have a capacity for choices. He typed with slow, deliberate fingers and then pocketed his phone. His eyes flicked up and he met hers for the briefest of seconds and then looked away as if pulled by an invisible tether. The smallness of the glance felt like an assessment. In the theater of the plane, looking away could be its own kind of agreement. Then, without warning, the woman with the necklace rose and approached the lavatory door. Her movement was light, but purposeful. She spoke before she reached it, her voice sharp enough to be a dagger. "I'm next," she said. "There are rules." Her words were a challenge dressed as civility. Grace watched her like someone watching a matchbox slide across a table. The air was thick with intent. From a distance, things looked like misread choreography. An occupied lavatory, a woman asking politely, another insisting on her turn. But close up, there were lines of history and of new designs overlapping. The woman with the necklace was not just another passenger. Her movement was timed, her words practiced. The broad-shouldered man stood, a motion that made seats creak, and he moved to stand guard with the woman. Jenna smiled, but with the same tightness, and the man, Aaron, folded his arms as if to watch a play. Grace felt something harden inside her chest. The urgency was no longer only about bathroom air, it was about being counted as a person with a right to small bodily mercies. The letter's paper cooled against her skin, and the 10 minutes blossomed into a possibility of public unmasking. She thought of calling out, of naming the slow, small things that had always been done with her in mind. But the plane hummed and the rules, written and unwritten, kept their slow tyranny. As the cabin rearranged itself around that small crisis, the seed of betrayal had been planted. It was small and precise, a choice made by other people that would perhaps save them an awkward moment while costing Grace a chance. In a larger world, betrayals often dress as convenience. The narrator watches and says nothing yet. The human voice, close and diplomatic, prepares to change everything. I remember faces the way other people remember songs, a line you can hum back when you need it. Grace's face held a tightened kindness, the kind that could still open like a door if you knocked the right way. The woman across from her, Rebecca, silver at the temples and patient in her smile, watched everything with the slow curiosity of someone who had learned that small moments reveal big things. Rebecca had been traveling alone too, a doctor returning from a short conference, and when Grace sat back down her hand, found Rebecca's without meaning to. Rebecca squeezed once, and the touch was a small lifeline. "You okay, dear?" Rebecca asked softly. Her voice had the calm of someone who had seen people come apart and come back together. Grace let out a breath that turned into a laugh without sound. "I will be," she said, "just tight schedule." She showed Rebecca nothing of the letter. Some things felt sharper when spoken. Others needed the soft armor of secrecy. From the impartial angle, relationships are data points, seatmates, pairings, alliances. But close in, people are weather systems. Grace and Rebecca formed a tiny front against the plane's indifferent wind. Rebecca's eyes kept moving to the lavatory door, and then back to Grace, a slow check of risk. "You have a child?" Rebecca asked when Grace mentioned Daniel. The name landed like a prayer. "Yes," Grace said. "He's 5. He's waiting." Jenna watched them from a distance, folding her hands, because that was what the safety training told her to do. Inside, her head hummed with a different kind of arithmetic. Every minute on a flight had rules attached. Every rule had a story of liability and past errors that could sink a career. She had a son, 2, Matthew, age 10, and the thought of losing her job felt like the jagged edge of a broken promise. Jenna's smile stayed polite. She wanted to help. She wanted to do the humane thing. She also wanted to keep the schedule tight and the airline off her back. "Ma'am," she said to Grace later, when the cabin had quieted into a thin hush. The words were careful. "If you need the lavatory, I can—" She stopped because her manager's voice lived in the back of her throat like a second conscience. Policies whispered no. Compassion whispered yes. Jenna's hands found the cart handle, and she anchored herself there, weighing one against the other. Aaron was an observer of a different sort. He kept his mouth shut because, for him, silence was a currency. He was used in negotiations that happened through looks, through ledger-like choices about what to report and what to hide. He had a daughter once. The memory was a picture he carried folded. He told himself the plane was not a place for trouble. He typed into his phone again, fingers moving to a rhythm. He noticed the letter's edge peeking from Grace's jacket and the name Grace Thomas registered like a misplaced file. That simple recognition moved something cold and precise through him, but he did nothing. He had reasons which he told himself were practical. He had a meeting, bills to pay, a life that ran on appointments. Claudia, the woman with the necklace, was another kind of weather. Her mouth made a line at the edges when she watched Grace, and she collected what looked like proof. Her husband had trained her to perform civility as armor. She measured people quickly and placed them into tidy boxes. Useful, annoying, obstacle. She loved control. When she leaned toward the lavatory moments earlier, her voice had been polite but sharp. Now she watched Grace through a net of suspicion and something that almost looked like fear. Fear wears many masks. Claudia's was the mask of entitlement. Conversation pulled them together and pushed them apart. "Are you traveling for work?" Aaron asked Grace at one point, the question neutral, like weather. "Sort of," she answered. "Family reasons mostly." The answers slid over each other. People told stories that fit what they wanted to give away. Grace kept her script short and most accurate. Daniel, apartment need. She did not tell Aaron about the man with the shoes in the garage, the lemon-scented paper, the way promises sometimes come wrapped in danger. Rebecca, who had been a doctor for 30 years, watched the way Jenna hesitated and knew the physics of small decisions. "She looks like she needs a hand," Rebecca said, quiet but firm. "We've all been there." Jenna met Rebecca's eyes, and for a moment the barrier loosened. The training manual lost some of its weight. The cart's shadow fell like a small cross on the aisle. "Okay," Jenna said. "Stay here," she told Grace, and then she walked forward with the careful speed of someone choosing a side. Inside Jenna's chest, the choice felt like stepping off a curb. She knew that a single choice could define an afternoon or a career. She also knew the voice of her son at home, the way he hummed when he drew, and the way he needed soccer shoes that still cost money. The math tightened. She made the small decision to help, telling herself she would write an incident report, keeping the language neutral. Compassion allows for paperwork. Aaron watched Jenna move and felt an old muscle, protectiveness, wake without consent. He had been silent because silence kept him safe. Now the air shifted. He could have intervened politely, asked Claudia to wait, and told the attendant they would share a turn. Instead, he kept his hands folded and thought about the meeting he would be late for. He told himself that the world could not be run by every small injustice. The narrator notices the small moral calculus and files it away. Grace sat back down feeling both steadier and exposed. The moment had revealed something loose in the cabin's skin. People's edges showed. She ran her thumb over the folded crease of the letter as if the paper could be smoothed by touch. She thought of Daniel's laugh, of how he would march across the living room pretending to be a dinosaur, of the tiny scuff mark on his favorite cup where he had dropped it last week. Those small things were her ballast. They were also the reason she felt filigreed fear. Fear that the world's small cruelties would compound and become a storm. Dialogue and silence braided. Rebecca offered a story about a patient who had fainted mid-flight and how a fellow passenger had stepped in without thought. "People surprise you," she said. "Most of the time, they surprise you in ways that make things better." Grace nodded because she wanted to believe it. Jenna felt her resolve sharpen. Aaron folded further inward, a quiet stone. Claudia's jaw tightened and the necklace gleamed like a warning. The observer notes that alliances form in low light, two women linked by a squeeze of hands, a flight attendant who chooses to risk paperwork for the small mercy, a man who chooses appointments over action. The narrator leans in and says that the small acts chosen now will echo later. Each character was a knot of need and fear, and the plane, a narrow stage, amplified the choices people made. Tensions sat like a storm front beyond the horizon. No one yet saw the lightning, but everyone could taste it in the air. They had settled back into their pockets like rocks dropped into a pool. The small ripples from the lavatory incident began to fold into the normal hush of flight. Grace felt steadier, like a boat that had righted itself after a shove. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and smoothed the fold of the letter again, feeling for the rhythm of its creases like a private code. Rebecca's hand found hers steady and warm, and the gesture was balm. For a bright second, Grace believed she had crossed the first tiny valley of a long trip and might go on. Then the world shifted. It arrived not with thunder, but with a detail so quiet it almost went unnoticed. Rebecca's fingers tightened, and for an instant her expression became something else. Sharp, precise, the doctor's calm followed by a measuring look. She blinked too slowly, the way someone who had been trained to see the small changes in a body notices the small changes in a room. Grace didn't read it at first. Who would? Kindness rarely bears a second face in the moment of reception. They spoke in small, ordinary fragments. About Daniel, about the end of the trip. Grace answered, because stories need ballast. Are you nervous? Rebecca asked, and the question was ordinary enough. Rebecca's eyes, however, flicked twice to the aisle and then to the pocket where Grace's letter rested like a pulse against cloth. Grace, in the privacy of her chest, felt a tremor. A little, she admitted. 10 minutes, she added, and the phrase sounded foolishly cryptic in a cabin of people pretending to sleep. Rebecca's face softened. You'll be all right, she said. Her voice sounded like a promise. Then, almost in the same breath, she rose and said she needed to use the restroom. Grace didn't think anything of it until Rebecca passed Claudia's row. The woman with the necklace smiled at Rebecca, and Rebecca smiled back with a mask that was fuller, practiced. As Rebecca walked away, her lips moved very slightly, a whisper made of intention. The narrator notices these small acts and records them. Nothing is random. Grace watched Rebecca go, and for a moment felt held by the small friendship, the kind that forms on flights, a stranger's sympathy offered in the liminal space between cities. She turned the letter over in her hand as the cabin dimmed into that thin, collective sleep. The words were steady. Keep your voice ready. 10 minutes. Her thumb hesitated on the edge where the ink had bled a little, and for the first time since the man in the garage pressed the paper into her fist, a small doubt uncoiled. The man had looked down at his shoes and spoken like someone making a foolish dare. Would he be the sort of person to sell someone else out, she wondered? The worry tasted like metal. When she rose to use the restroom herself, because staying still had become a kind of cruelty and nerves made her skin prickle, she expected privacy. The lavatory door closed with its soft, compliant thud. It smelled of lemon and disinfectant and the faint leftover trace of other people. Grace held the letter under the light and unfolded it fully for the first time in the cramped privacy. There were more lines than she'd seen. A time, a seat number, a line that read, "Call if anything goes wrong, 555-01. The script was hurried, almost desperate. At the bottom, a small line in different ink read, "Watch for Rebecca." Her chest tightened like a fist. The narrator leans in here to report the anatomy of trust. When a kindness is named and then referenced as a marker, suspicion blooms. Grace smoothed the paper and pressed it back into her jacket, the fabric warm against the ink. She stood, steadying herself against the mirrors reflecting truth, and for a second imagined Daniel's small face. The pull of being a mother tightened the spine of her resolve. The mirror offered her a face that looked tired and fierce at once. She let herself breathe. When she opened the door, she expected the aisle to be empty. The plane would be in its middle-hour hush. Instead, Aaron stood there, angled like a question, and behind him Rebecca's profile showed against the dimmed cabin light. The sight tipped a small balance. Aaron's expression was flat, not curious but not hostile. He had the look of someone expecting a meeting. Rebecca's eyes were a different shape now, cool, professional. "Aren't you Grace Thomas?" Aaron asked. His voice was careful, not unkind, like someone trying to test the water. The name landed in her chest like an animal that had been waiting. She froze. "Yes," she said, and that single syllable felt loud. She had not meant to use her name as a proclamation on this flight. names are small anchors, and yet they can pull a whole network after them. I recognized you from a piece, Aaron continued. You testified a year ago about the company he didn't finish because he didn't have to. The memory of a courtroom or a public hearing hung in the air like a scent. The observer would take this as exposition. To Grace, it felt like a current pulling at a rope. Her face must have given something because Rebecca stepped closer, and for the first time her hands were not steady. I'm sorry, Rebecca said, voice shaped like an apology, but without heat. We should have introduced ourselves before this. Her hand rested with professional ease on a badge clipped to her jacket that flashed a tiny logo Grace didn't recognize at first. The light caught letters SLA, Security Liaison Aviation. The badge, the logo, and the precise wording of her sentence made the rune contract. Grace's first thought was small and bewildered. Did Rebecca, her friend, the woman who had squeezed her hand an hour ago, work for the airline? The thought was too big to fit into a moment, but the world has a way of insisting. The narrator watches a private collapse when the map of people shifts beneath your feet. Aaron's mouth quivered. He held something in his hand that showed itself with a very slight motion. A small recorder, the kind meant to be discreet. We've been watching for anyone who could start a scene, he said, voice dry. The man who gave you the note is known. He tries to orchestrate incidents to make viral claims. We needed identification. The words were compressed, brief, like a formal verdict. The betrayal was not violent. It was a maneuver of languages and badges. Grace felt the floor tilt. The letter's folded edges suddenly felt like evidence in her palm. The man in the garage, was he a setup? Has someone corralled her into a script written by others? The narrator notes how quickly the world rearranges. An offered hand becomes a net. Rebecca's smile, the squeeze that had felt like comfort, folded inward into something like a protocol. We're sorry for the confusion, Ms. Thomas, she said, and the apology did not reach her eyes. But we can't allow people to make false reports on flights. For everyone's safety, we have to ensure things are in order. You what? Grace asked before she could measure the question. The letter burned in her jacket, a tinderbox. Her voice, when it came, was small and brittle. This was not a false report. 10 minutes. 10 minutes to cause an incident, Aaron said, and the word snapped like a wire. It's how they operate. Create an altercation, stir outrage online. Airlines get accused, passengers get harmed. We've seen this pattern. His eyes settled on Rebecca with an understanding that excluded Grace. Rebecca's jaw moved, a muscle that showed the work of habit. We're just making sure nothing escalates. In the space between the sentences, Grace had a burst of clarity that felt like being forced to look at a painting only to realize the image had been altered. The man in the garage, who had looked at his shoes and spoken like a dare, was not a messenger of help. He might have been a handler, a provocateur. The letter had been folded into her life like a trap. The narrator observes the anatomy of betrayal. It is often built of common things: smiles, a hand squeeze, a badge clipped to a jacket. Rebecca's face was gentle, devastated in the expression of a professional who had to deliver bad news. I didn't want you to be upset, she said finally, but we have to prevent false claims. We're on the lookout for people who incite disruption. The words were clinical and the warmth had gone. Grace's stomach pitched. She felt small and exposed, like a bird with its wing touched. Her mind raced through the last days. The man in the garage, the lemon scent, the way he had given her the paper as if it were an offering. All of it stitched into something that now reads as manipulation. She thought of Daniel's laugh, the sticker he'd misplaced on his drawing, the way small joys gave her courage. The betrayal cut not only into her pride, but into the foundation of what she thought she could trust in other people. You can check me, she said, voice steadying. Look at my phone. Look at my messages. I'm not trying to start anything. The plea had something of terror. In the plane's narrow world, words had weight. Rebecca nodded as if this were an expected performance. Aaron produced a small form and asked for her name, her contact, and a description. The narrator records the procedural motions, signatures, boxes to tick. They were the theater of containment. As Grace filled out the tiny formalities with a hand that no longer felt like hers, she caught sight of Daniel's photo again in her folder. The boy smiled with a cowlick and an honest, messy laugh. The image steadied her in a way nothing else could. The betrayal had not taken him, but it had taken the simple arithmetic of trust and replaced it with ledger lines and badges. When they led her back to her seat, Rebecca's hand found hers one last time, gentle but precise, and in that touch there was no longer friendship so much as duty. The cabin settled back into its simmering silence, and the plane kept slicing through the thin blue. The narrator watches with an impartial ache, a world rearranged by a single act of quiet collusion. The letter in Grace's pocket hummed like something alive. The twist had reoriented the map. Allies could be agents. Kindness could be a mark. The journey ahead had become more bitterly complicated. The cabin felt smaller after the paperwork. It smelled of coffee and fear now, a brittle mix that made Grace's throat close. People returned to their screens and their small private rituals, but every glance that brushed her felt like an examination. Rebecca sat one row ahead, shoulders squared in the way of someone who carried a badge and a rule book. Jenna moved down the aisle with a cart that rattled like a metronome. Aaron folded his arms and watched as if the whole scene were a ledger to be balanced. Claudia hunched into her seat, necklace bright as a challenge. Grace touched the photo of Daniel in her folder as if the paper were armor. The narrator leans close, the empathetic voice soft now. Fear is not always loud. Often it is a quiet that hollowed your ribs, a pressure that makes small choices suddenly feel like battlegrounds. Grace felt that pressure like water against a dam. She had expected a fuss, maybe a mild interrogation, a form to be signed, but not this, an invisible weight that could decide whether someone believed her or branded her. The pilot's voice came through the overhead speakers then, calm and neutral, a voice meant to steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been notified of a potential disturbance involving a passenger. For safety, we will be met by ground security upon landing. Please remain seated. The words folded the cabin into a kind of stunned silence. 100 small lives rearranged themselves around those syllables. The observer sees the procedure. The human inside the procedure sees the potential of being placed under a light you cannot turn away from. Grace's heart beat against the letter in her jacket like a trapped thing. The 10 minutes on the paper had become a countdown stretched by layers of other people's decisions. She could feel her temperature rise. The pressure behind her sternum was thicker. If she were escorted off the plane, if questions were asked, if someone, Claudia, Aaron, even Rebecca, pulled a narrative that painted her as trouble, Daniel's morning would unravel. The child might be left with a neighbor who hated babysitting, or worse, with social workers who spiderweb records into her life. The thought of that small, bright face waiting in the apartment made her almost dizzy. Inside, the dilemma set up two tracks that ran into one another. Tell the whole truth now and risk sounding like the sort of person who gets caught in contrived schemes, or play quiet and hope the moment passes and life resumes. The narrator's impartial voice notes probabilities. The compassionate voice knows that probabilities are poor company for a mother. Grace weighed the facts like someone sorting seeds. The letter might be a trap. The man who handed it to her might have been a provocateur. But accusing him without proof could look like a weak defense. Silence could be read as guilt. Rebecca watched Grace from her seat with an unreadable face. For a brief moment she softened and mouthed, "Be calm." It was a counsel that might have been kindness or a rehearsal of protocol. Jenna's eyes met Grace's across the aisle, and there was a flash of something like an apology. The stewardess's hands tightened on the cart as if it were a brace. She moved with the kind of small courage that sometimes never becomes a story. The cabin buzzed with whispered theories. Someone mentioned social media. Someone else said lawsuits. A child giggled 2 rows back, unaware of how the adults were rearranging meanings like furniture. Claudia had already pulled out her phone and was scrolling with a small, fierce attention. The narrator notes what the small devices do. They make private things public in a single careless gesture. Grace imagined a live video, a caption, 1,000 opinions with the cruelty of a mob. She had seen how public outrage could feel like a wave that washed people away. She looked down at the letter again, the handwriting at the bottom. Watch for Rebecca, not at her. Had someone known Rebecca would be on this flight? Had they planned a scene that used a security liaison as a character? If so, it explained the tight choreography. If not, then Rebecca's presence was mere coincidence and the accusation was cruel. The thought of being used like a pawn made something inside her garden. An email notification pinged through the cabin like a firefly. Aaron's phone lit up, he glanced at it, and for an instant Grace read headlines in the way his face changed. He pushed his phone's screen toward his lap as if hiding a document. The urge to stand up and demand clarity rose like bile. She restrained herself with the image of Daniel folding his small fingers around a crayon. The decision to stay seated felt like a bargain with fear. Inside, a smaller war began. She rehearsed words. This is a misunderstanding. I got this note from someone in the garage. I don't want trouble. I only want to get home. Each phrase felt either too weak or too explosive. There was also another thought. She could not dislodge. What if confronting them made things worse? What if she exposed the man in the garage and he came after her later? The idea of retaliation landed colder than any rebuke. People with dangerous networks do not always move with guns and bravado. They move with reputation, with planted evidence, with friends who carry badges. Grace pictured Daniel opening the door and looking for her. The way his face crinkled when he missed her. Her throat tightened. The choice became a moral geometry. Protect yourself and risk leaving the pattern of manipulation intact, or challenge it now and risk immediate harm. The narrator does not judge. The empathic voice knows that the scale of motherhood often makes choices into sacrifices. She rose slowly and walked to the restroom again. The mirror was a small island where she could name what she felt. She practiced speaking into the glass until sentences stopped sounding like foreign words. When she left, she found Rebecca waiting outside, face composed but softer than before. Grace, Rebecca said in a whisper, we can talk quietly. Please trust me. The words were an offer, but trust was a currency spent quickly and hard to rebuild. Inside, Grace's mind flicked through the earlier kindness Rebecca had shown, the hand squeeze, the soft questions. Could that have been genuine? Or was it a preparation, a softening before a roll? The memory of that first touch now had an edge that could cut. Her hands trembled. She thought of asking Rebecca to reveal what she knew, to tell her outright why her name had been on a list. But asking could sound like an accusation. Rebecca could reply with protocol. The plane's thin walls felt like paper between them and a world that might judge. Behind them, Jenna hovered. The stewardess's voice, when she leaned in, was a small breath. We're following orders, she said. If you want to explain to ground security, it's better you tell them your side before anything is said publicly. There it was again. The option to preempt a story by controlling the narrative. To speak first or be spoken for. The advice was practical. It also came with a cost. Going to ground security might mean being detained, questioned, missing the afternoon with Daniel. Not going might mean being misrepresented. The cabin contracted. People's lives touched in a thin, brittle way, and each choice echoed in a small, private way. Grace sat back down and for the first time let fear turn into something sharper, strategy. She would not be passive, not because she wanted confrontation, but because every day she had to choose small strategies to keep Daniel safe, which bus to take, which neighbor to trust, which bills to pay. This was another kind of ledger. The narrator notes the transformation, from fear to strategy, from being moved by others to moving herself. She began composing a short, clear statement in her head. Who gave me this note? When, where? I have no intent to cause harm. I am trying to go home to my child. Keep it simple, keep it honest. If there was betrayal, she thought it would be exposed not by spectacle, but by patience and clarity. The silence in the cabin hummed like a held breath. Outside, the sky was a thin, indifferent blue. Inside, decisions stacked like cards, and Grace understood that some of them would fall one way or another and leave marks that could not be smoothed away. The cabin turned into a theater at the exact moment truth became a sound. Engines hummed a neutral backdrop, overhead lights threw small halos on faces. Everyone leaned forward without meaning to, because when a recording started playing, there was no choice but to listen. Aaron set his phone on his knee and hit play. The first seconds were nothing but low static. Then a man's voice, the man from the garage, low and oily, came through clear enough to make the skin on Grace's arms prickle. "She's perfect," the voice said. "We'll fold the paper into her life. 10 minutes. Let Rebecca be on the plane." There was a faint click, a muffled laugh, and then another voice, Rebecca's, so close that Grace felt the sound ache. "Good. Make sure she looks sincere. If she resists, escalate. We can't have a scene that can't be controlled." The impartial narrator notes the mechanics. A recording is evidence the way a photograph is small, simple, and indisputable to a crowd that cannot rewrite the sound later. The empathetic voice knows what that sound does inside a chest. It pulls open old wounds and forces them to breathe. For a beat, nobody moved. Then Claudia's hand, which had been clenched around her phone, dropped like a curtain. Her face went white. Jenna's cart clattered to a stop. Passengers who had been trying to ignore the tension now faced a theatrical reveal. Rebecca's composed expression cracked as if someone had drawn a line through it with a knife. She swallowed, fingers finding her badge like a talisman. "You can't," Rebecca began, voice thin. Her mouth made arguments, and the cabin took in words like air. "That's not, I didn't." Aaron's voice was steady, which made it sound like a blade. "You told him exactly what to do, Rebecca. I captured that conversation last week when you followed up. You arranged the note. You planted the man." His hand did not shake when he held the phone up, as if offering proof to the whole plane. "You were working with him to manufacture incidents so the airline could counter public complaints. We have the messages, the transfers. You did it to protect a client who benefits when whistleblowers are discredited." The narrator watches the small arithmetic of exposure. Receipts, recordings, the tiny transactions that make up a lie. The empathetic voice remembers the first touch between Grace and Rebecca, the hand squeeze, and how tender it had felt. The same hand had been used as an instrument of damage. Betrayal is often intimate, the voice says. It hurts because it was soft first. Rebecca made a move as if to reach for Aaron's phone. Her face pleaded for understanding. "You don't know the whole context," she implored. "We are trying to prevent chaos. People orchestrate incidents that endanger passengers. You told them to use a woman who would be believable," Aaron said, and the words landed with cold precision. "You told him to look nervous, to hand her the paper, to watch for you. You recorded your call with him on the 14th. He tapped the screen. Another voice, this time the man's, played, an exchange about payments made through a shell company. The cabin had turned into an evidence room and audience both. Across the seats, Jenna's eyes filled. Her hands quivered on the cart. The stewardess had been trained to follow rules, but she had also been watching lives at the edges and understanding that rules sometimes break people. "You lied to me," she said to Rebecca, small and simple. "You used me to keep you safe." Rebecca's breathing became quick, ragged. In the way one might extinguish a small flame, she tried to reframe it. Protocol, safety, altruism in the name of order. But the plane held recording after recording. Aaron had more than one file. He had kept a ledger. He played texts that showed transfers, receipts to a company linked to Claudia's legal firm, messages arranging the choreography. The audience unspooled the story in real time. A conspiracy that used manufactured outrage to discredit people who could harm a client's interest, and a woman, Grace, chosen because she was vulnerable and right now alone. Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Rebecca's, hesitantly reached, now useless. The hand did not warm her. She stood slowly because the motion made the plane creak, and someone laughed, a high, brittle sound. Her voice, when it came, was level, not pleading. "Why me?" she asked. "Why use me like that?" The question was small, and the answer came in a sibilant whisper of self-preservation and calculation. "Because you spoke up," Rebecca finally admitted, and the admission was uglier than any denial. "You made noise, and the company wanted to quiet it. We thought if we discredited the source, the bigger story would die. Her face went slack. The plane listened like a jury. Claudia's fingers flew to her mouth, and a color drained from her face when Aaron mentioned her firm. Some passengers nodded in slow shock. Others stayed frozen, the way people do when the world changes one small fact at a time. The pilot's voice through the speakers tried to reimpose calm and became a thin sound against the noise of moral revelation. Then another twist landed, sharp as glass. Jenna stepped forward. The narrator notes this moment like a pivot. The stewardess opened the overhead compartment and pulled out a small envelope, airline-issued forms, a faintly official stamp. It was paperwork Jenna had been compelled to sign earlier, dates and lines that showed Rebecca had escalated false claim prevention at higher levels, but the form had an attachment, an internal memo that named specific targets, including Grace's department and the logic used to justify the tactic. It had been marked confidential, stamped with a signature that matched a name tied to a client. Someone had to do something, Jenna said, but not like this. Her voice did not tremble now. She handed the envelope to Aaron. I asked for clarification yesterday. They told me to trust the liaison. Her face softened when she looked at Grace. I didn't want to be part of this. The pilot announced over the PA that ground security would meet them and that anyone accused would be handled by authorities. The cabin waited. The observer records the choreography. Evidence, confession, compulsion. When the plane landed, people clapped softly, but it was not the applause of relief only. It was the noise of solidarity. Ground security met them, eyes bright with the job's gravity, and the airline's own compliance team stepped aboard, faces taut. Rebecca was asked to come forward. Her badge was taken. She did not resist in the end because there are ways to hold a life together and ways that require letting go. Grace walked down the jetway with Daniel's photograph in her hand. The air outside the plane smelled like tarmac and possibility. Reporters clustered on the concourse because a recording had leaked into the feeds as soon as Aaron had sent copies to a watchdog he trusted. The second twist, that Aaron had not been a passive onlooker, but an undercover journalist who had been tracking Rebecca for weeks, changed the choreography of blame into something like public accountability. He had chosen to play the recording on the plane rather than keep it for later precisely to counteract the private humiliations orchestrated in small rooms. They let Grace go. She was shaken but not detained. Rebecca was escorted for questioning. Claudia refused to look at the woman she had watched with suspicion all flight, and passengers exchanged looks that were less about curiosity than about the small victory of truth. Later, when the day wound down and the city leaned toward night, Grace held Daniel in the small living room of their apartment, the boy's breath warm against her shoulder. The narrator observes the scene with a softer lens. A mother returned, a life not unscathed but continuing. The empathic voice speaks the moral plainly. The world will sometimes try to use you as a symbol, a pawn, a test. It will do so because systems value reputation over people. But people strangers on a plane, a stewardess who chose to risk paperwork, a journalist who kept proof, can choose otherwise. Grace did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and sharper, like an instrument polished by weather. She understood now that trust is fragile and costly, that kindness can be weaponized, but also that courage is contagious. She placed Daniel's small drawings on the table and watched him sleep. Outside, a headline flashed across a phone. Whistleblower targeted, airline probe opens. Grace let the words settle. She had been betrayed, publicly and privately, but she had also been seen. In the end, the plane had been crucible. It has exposed the small economies of power and the ways they buy safety at the price of someone's life. Grace's life had shifted. Less naive, more resolute. But the last image that lingers is not of betrayal. It is of Daniel's face, peaceful in sleep, and of a woman who had learned how to push back. The moral hangs like a clear window. Systems make rules, people make choices. When the dust settled, the world around Grace felt both quieter and louder than before. The immediate noise, The cameras, the emails, the calls from people she had never met dulled into a steady hum. Authorities opened inquiries. The airline issued statements that read like careful recipes for damage control. Rebecca was placed on leave. Her badge was suspended, and later, after several interviews, she would face internal charges that would follow her career for years. Claudia's law firm quietly severed ties with certain clients. Aaron's recordings rippled outward, sparking coverage that forced more questions than answers. Jenna returned to her crew with a new kind of weight in her hands. Paperwork balanced against conscience. None of that erased what had happened, but it rearranged the forces that had made it possible. Grace learned quickly that justice rarely arrives in a single neat moment. It comes in small, grinding processes. Hearings that take weeks, interviews conducted in windowless rooms, apologies that sound like rehearsed lines. She had her own small victories: a public apology from the airline's compliance department, a private letter from an executive offering restitution, and she had losses too: the sense that a world she had trusted could fabricate scenes with surgical ease. The legal team that took her case would not change everyone's mind, but they secured a modest settlement and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. For Grace, those tangible things mattered less than something quieter: the right to tell her story on her own terms. At home, Daniel did not care about settlements and press releases. He cared about the way his mother could hum the tune of his favorite cartoon while she made him grilled cheese, about whether she would come to school play, about whether his soccer cleats would still fit next season. Caring for him brought Grace back to an axis of small, irreplaceable routines. The apartment smelled of laundry and late-night noodles. Daniel's drawings plastered the fridge like proof that life continued in the ordinary, unstaged moments. Grace found comfort in the ordinary again, in the sound of keys dropping into a bowl by the door, in the way Daniel fell asleep with his thumb in his mouth, in the soft thud of the radiator. Yet the moral questions did not leave her. She had been the instrument of a scheme she had not known she was in, and the memory of Rebecca's touch, once warm then cold with calculation, stayed like a bruise. Grace spent evenings staring at the photograph of Daniel and asking herself how to teach him about truth without scarring him with cynicism. How do you explain that some people will weaponize kindness? How do you help a child learn to trust without making him afraid of every open hand? She found some answers in unlikely places. Jenna visited once, bringing a small box of apology cookies from the in-flight galley and a mended badge pinned to a note for choosing the right thing, even when it cost you. They spoke in the kitchen, leaning across the table while Daniel drew dinosaurs on the placemat. Jenna confessed that she had been terrified of the cost of pushing back, the potential to lose shifts, to be reprimanded, to let her son down. "We make choices with what we have," she said. "I wanted to keep my job, too. But seeing you there, the whole thing felt wrong." Her apology felt like a first honest draft of atonement. Grace accepted it with the reserve of someone who had learned the limits of forgiveness and the value of restored trust. Rebecca reached out later through counsel. Her message was short and complicated. An admission that the pressure had come from above, that fear had justified the wrong actions, and that she had been both participant and victim of a system that prized reputations over human costs. There was no neat absolution in her words. She had broken something that could not be easily glued back together. But she offered a meeting, face-to-face, out of court. Grace met her in a small, quiet room months after the flight. Rebecca's eyes were raw. She had the look of someone whose professional muscles had atrophied under the strain of consequences. "I wanted to prevent harm," Rebecca said. "I told myself it was the necessary evil. I was wrong." Grace listened. The admission did not undo the betrayal, but it did something else. It complicated the story. People are rarely only villains or saints. Rebecca had made a nested set of choices under pressure, and those choices had ripple effects. Grace felt anger, sharp and justified, but also a new clarity. The world was messy, and while she would not excuse manipulation, she could hold space for the fact that systems push people toward choices that corrode them. That complexity informed Grace's next step. She began to speak publicly, not from a place of triumph, but from a place of careful witness. She accepted invitations to panels about whistleblower protections, about the ethics of corporate reputation management. She spoke in simple, steady language about how ordinary people can be swept into manufactured spectacles and how institutions must be accountable. She did not become a crusader overnight. She was still a mother with a job and bills and a small child who wanted dinosaur pancakes. But the act of telling her story put a little more pressure on the broader system. It was not enough to change everything, but it was something, a light on a hinge. At night, when the apartment drifted toward sleep and the city outside dimmed into a murmur, Grace would think of the man in the garage, of the quiet way he had pressed the paper into her hand. She wondered where he was now, whether his role in the chain had been traced back to him, or whether he would quietly move on to other small cruelties. She recognized, in those moments, the necessity of staying alert without becoming bitter. There was a difference between losing trust and losing faith in the possibility that people could choose differently. The hardest lesson was personal. Grace had always avoided confrontation. She avoided taking up space that felt not hers. The flight taught her that there are moments when silence becomes a form of surrender. Protecting Daniel meant taking up weight she had once thought too heavy. It meant learning to speak clearly, to document, to insist. It meant recognizing that small acts, Jenna's courage, Aaron's persistence, the journalists who followed the thread, could become levers. Choosing action did not guarantee safety, but it made harm harder to hide. Months later, in the soft afterglow of a day that felt ordinary, Grace sat at the kitchen table and watched Daniel glue sequins onto a paper star. He looked up and said, matter of fact, "Mama, did you work today?" She smiled, the answer obvious, and realized that the true work had always been quieter than all the public things. It was here, in stitches, in school runs, in being there when a child needed a hand to tie a shoelace. Grace's reflection on the affair never hardened into a single moral pronouncement. Instead, it became a set of guiding sentences she repeated to herself when choices came. Tell the truth plainly, protect those you love fiercely, and be wary of people who offer easy solutions to complicated questions. She believed in the possibility of repair, but she also believed in consequence. Systems needed both accountability and compassion. People needed to be held responsible without being turned into flat moral caricatures. In the end, the plane had been a crucible that reshaped her. She was not the same woman who had boarded months ago with a folded note in her pocket. She was smaller in some ways, more aware of how brittle trust could be, and larger in others, more willing to stand in the light when necessary. The final image that settled for her, simple and stubborn, was of Daniel asleep with his cheek against her palm, breathing steady in its small rhythm. She pressed her forehead lightly against his and let the weight of all the days, the betrayals, the small mercies, the hard choices, fall into a shape she could carry. There are no grand endings in real life, only different kinds of continuations. Grace chose hers, to keep living, to keep telling the truth, and to teach her son that the world could wound him, but also hold him, if he and others chose to be brave in the small ways that matter most. So, tell me, if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.